Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and thank you for coming for what I think is our last formal lecture at the Center for the Study of the Middle East for the academic year, I think. Is that right? We have one more lunch and a lecture. That's all I can think of at least, but keep your eye on your inboxes. One last thing I should say before I get on to the festivities, so to speak, is please sign in if you haven't already done so. We need that for our reporting. I have to say that every time, so there should hopefully be sheets circulating. Please do sign in. Even if you're already receiving our mailing list, you can indicate that. If you prefer not to receive our mailing list, you can indicate that too. And obviously, if you do wish to receive the mailing list, you can, oddly enough, indicate that as well. I am absolutely delighted to present our speaker this afternoon. And not only because, as it turns out, she's a cousin of mine, but that turns out not to be her most important feature, but it is one of the delightful things about having her here. An enduring memory of mine of Zainab Bahrani is that we were almost killed together in Baghdad in 2004 when the Americans extended the checkpoints deeper into the red zone, as it's called, farther away from the center of the green zone in Baghdad. The signs said stop or slow down or else deadly force will be used. The problem was that the driver and the guard sitting in the front couldn't read English, and Zainab and I were happily chatting away in the back. I claim there was a red dot bouncing around in the middle of the car, which is the laser of them aiming at us. Whether that's true or apocryphal, who knows, but it makes for a good story. In any event, I am delighted to introduce Zainab Bahrani, who is an alumna of Indiana University, having gotten her undergraduate degree in the art history department here in 1981. She also, of course, received her master's and PhD in a joint program of ancient Near Eastern and Greek art and archaeology at NYU. Prior to her current appointment as the Edith Porada Professor of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University, Professor Bahrani taught at the University of Vienna in Austria, the State University of New York at Stony Brook, also in New York, of course, and was curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Near Eastern Antiquities Department from 1989 to 1992. Professor Bahrani is a prolific author. She's the author and editor of 12 books and more than 50 articles on topics ranging from ancient Near Eastern archaeology to contemporary art criticism and publication, such as Art History, Art Journal, the Oxford Art Journal, and October. She teaches a wide range of undergraduate and graduate lectures and seminars on ancient Near Eastern art and archaeology, as well as on the theories and methods of art history. And she advises PhD students, of course, in these fields. Another aspect of her work has been in the area of monument preservation, which we will hear about today, conservation, and the politics of cultural heritage. Some of her academic publications focus on the subject from a theoretical perspective. But since 2003, Professor Bahrani has also written widely on the destruction of the cultural heritage of Iraq in the popular press in publications such as The Nation, The Guardian, and The Wall Street Journal. In the summer of 2004, Professor Bahrani was senior advisor, and here you can read de facto minister. She was senior advisor to Iraq's Ministry of Culture. During that time, she conducted a survey of war damage at the archaeological site of Babylon and instigated the state of Iraq's official request for the removal of the military base from the site. I should point out she served in that capacity, even though, and this was a point of dispute between us, she opposed the war in Iraq in 2003, yet she accepted this position in order to do what she could to help to preserve Iraq's archaeological heritage. Professor Bahrani considers archaeological fieldwork to be central to her work. She is the director of a Columbia University survey project that covers Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, mapping Mesopotamian monuments. Zainab Bahrani was awarded the Lionel Trilling Book Prize in 2015, the James Henry Breasted Book Prize in 2009, and the Lenfest Distinguished Faculty Award at Columbia in 2008. In addition, Professor Bahrani is a recipient of numerous fellowship awards. Well, I could go on, but I won't. Please welcome Professor Zainab Bahrani.
For inviting me here today for this really nice invitation, and I am looking forward to telling you a little bit about my field project, but I think, first of all, let me drop that. What I'd like to do is to start by giving you a bit of an overview about ancient Mesopotamia itself. And then I will go from there to speaking about contemporary cultural heritage preservation. And as you'll see, I take the two to be very closely related. So although it might seem like I'm going off into a different direction, I think, or I hope that you'll see by the end of this lecture that it goes together. So do I control the slides?
Put it right on the table right there next to
So I'll stand here.
There's a clicker.
Okay, so this is good because then I can sort of, okay, I think you can all see the slide. So today I'd like to discuss how the destruction of monuments and conversely the preservation of monuments become aspects of warfare and violent conflict and also of legal discourse. As art historians and archaeologists, we are well aware that iconoclasm and monument destruction throughout history have been validated by the idea of just war. While iconoclasm and collateral destruction are known to be aspects of warfare, preservation is also an aspect of conflict archaeology, what we would call conflict archaeology. So I would like to present my current fieldwork to you as a project of preservation that fits within this field of conflict archaeology. But in order to introduce this work, I'll first take you to the past, to ancient Mesopotamian historical consciousness and how it was related to standing monuments and the historical architecture that was part of their urban fabric in antiquity. So my lecture will go from the past to present and back again. But I hope that you will see all of this fitting in. These are views of Nimrud in Iraq, which is one of the main sites, the most famous sites that was destroyed by ISIS very recently, as I'm sure you probably all know. 2,500 years before the beginning of the Christian era, a Sumerian monument was erected in the south of modern-day Iraq. The monument is now in the Louvre Museum in Paris. It's a large stele carved on both sides with relief images and inscribed with a long text about war and its conclusion. Although much scholarly attention has been given to its various features, one aspect of the ancient text here hasn't been given due recognition, and it's really rather interesting. Among the oaths that were sworn to the gods at the end of the war and recorded here on this stele are promises by the warring parties that they would neither destroy nor dislocate the monuments. To date, this is the earliest known historical monument in world history, and it tells us that already at this time, in 2500 BC, the deliberate destruction and removal of a monument from its site was taken to be an act of war, and also a war crime. This is Palmyra on the left, and Nimrud on the right, and on the bottom right is Hatra, sites in Iraq and Syria. In today's scholarship and journalism about cultural heritage destruction in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere in the world, We often hear or read that cultural preservation is a modern or a Western concern, having to do with the idea of modernity, and that this was not recognized in earlier eras. But this is really not the case. I'm presenting to you the evidence from antiquity not simply as a lesson in archaeology, but to make the case that human beings and monuments are always entangled in their histories. Mesopotamia stands as an example of at least one ancient culture where monuments were understood as having a vital agency of their own. This agency was not ascribed to them, but inherent within their logic as monuments. And their destruction was therefore seen as having a direct effect on the people and the land, the king and his reign. As it was one of the most highly literate cultures in antiquity, there are a great deal of textual evidence and archaeological evidence also to make this case. Today, the attempt to eradicate the past of both Syria and Iraq is aimed at the obliteration of exactly this earliest Mesopotamian history, a history that local populations have long considered to be their own heritage and a basis of their collective past, something that transcends religion and ethnicity. It is for this reason that historical monuments are now being deliberately targeted. It is a strategy that aims to create a terra nullius, a land that belongs to no one and has no prior historical claims, so that it is a no man's land available for conquest. Thus, the strategy of obliteration aims to create a land ready for the rewriting of history with a new vision, cleansed from its pre-Islamic past, and cleansed also of any evidence of the thousands of years of existence of peoples and religions that do not suit the worldview of the ideology of Wahhabism. To counter that obliteration of history and to demonstrate how people and edifices were closely linked, I will recount the earliest writings on the place of monuments found in the discourse of just war and war crimes, and the significant textual and archaeological evidence for the ancient concerns with preservation and restoration. And I should just point out that many of the images that I'm going to show you here of archaeological sites are photographs that I am making with my team. We're a team that goes out on site in Iraq and southeastern Turkey right now to document these monuments as a way to preserve them. So the ancient Mesopotamians lived in what is now Iraq, northeastern Syria, and southeastern Turkey. So we don't work within the modern borders, but within the ancient geography. It was here where people in the world first started to create inscribed or textual historical monuments. The purpose of these monuments was to endure into the distant future. That's how they conceived of them. We read in the ancient texts that their monuments were also thought of as site-specific works meant to be present for all time. Their inscriptions, the ones written on these monuments, often address viewers who were to see them in the distant future. These works were made of various materials and in many forms, including freestanding steles of sculpture and inscribed stones, relief sculptures carved on the cliffs in the mountainside and set in magnificent works of architecture. Their materials, stone or brick, were considered to have inherent supernatural qualities. Their monumental buildings were both religious and secular in nature. They also had a literature in Sumerian and Babylonian that praised these works as remarkable and astonishing things that future generations would admire and should admire. The first poetical descriptions of architecture we have to date which is something that in archaeology and art history we refer to as Ekphrasis, using the Greek term. In these ancient texts of Ekphrasis and Ekphrasis, future generations were asked specifically to preserve these works. When monuments and architectural edifices were destroyed, when cities were ravaged by war, laments and requiems were written and sung on behalf of the destroyed built structures, just as they were for the people who had been killed, enslaved, and devastated by war. So they had poetry and songs and laments that they actually sang for buildings, for structures, in addition to the ones that they had about human beings. These laments, with their descriptions of civilian deaths and destruction of historical architecture, are particularly poignant and moving in the context of today's violence. These acts of war and discourses of war and its aftermath were also defined as part of the Me, M-E, written in capital letters. That's a Sumerian word, and it's a Sumerian list of concepts and things that are associated with civilization. The may include the arts, music, sculpture, and all kinds of positive and creative things and activities, but they also include aspects of life that are negative, such as warfare. For the Mesopotamians, seeing war as part of the may was a way of acknowledging that warfare is an inevitable aspect of civilization, and therefore rules of war were established. The Sumerians already practiced what we later call in Latin jus ad bellum, or just war. The act of war against another city was not acceptable unless it was defensive. The stele with which I began this paper, you see some other fragments on the left here, was erected by a man called Eannatum of Lagash, and it's the earliest historical monument known. It's a monument to victory, but at the same time it's also a contractual agreement. It's a peace treaty set up after the battle between the city-states of Lagash and Umma. Before the battle with Umma, Eannatum received a divine message in a dream oracle that sanctioned the war, and he justified his battle as a defense of the territory of Lagash in southern Iraq. So already in the mid-3rd millennium BC, the Sumerians practiced diplomacy. Before a war, envoys were sent to try to find a diplomatic solution for border conflicts. It was only when these failed that a messenger would be sent with a declaration of war in advance of the actual attack. The taking of lives of others, even for the king and his military, was a source of great anxiety and required justification and sanction from the gods. Among the oaths that were made repeatedly were oaths related to the protection of monuments themselves. Kings had to swear that they would not transgress borders and also that they would not destroy monuments. So the destruction of monuments was already defined as an act of war in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. Conversely, the destruction of a monument was considered a legitimate reason to launch a just war. Throughout Mesopotamian history, monument destruction, or the theft and dislocation of monuments and statues, were often declared as the ostensible reason for launching a just war. As the text of Eannatum makes clear, the destruction of a monument was a criminal act, and it was tantamount to the breaking of a peace treaty. The opposite side of this anxiety over the destruction of monuments is the ancient concern with preservation and conservation. This is a building in the south of Iraq from the time of around Alexander the Great's era. Extensive information about restoration and preservation of works of historical architecture also exists, especially in ritual texts. About 2,000 years after the Sumerian stele of Ea-Natum was erected, texts reveal that these kinds of concerns remained in full force. During the reconstruction of a building, the brick god, they had a brick god, a god that was devoted only to bricks. This brick god required prayers. Instructions for restoration dating to the Seleucid era, that's the 4th to the 3rd centuries BC, so the time of Alexander and a bit later, say, and I'm going to quote to you from this ancient text just to give you a bit of a taste of what the texts are like. So it says, I quote, "When the wall of a temple falls into ruin, in order to demolish it and refound that temple, the diviner shall investigate the site for ancient remains. The builder of the temple shall put on clean clothes and put on a tin bracelet on his arm. He shall take an axe of lead, remove the first brick, and put it in a restricted place. You set up an offering table in front of that brick god. You put a brick on the offering table, and you offer sacrifices to the brick god." So end of quote. These instructions for a restoration ritual show that architectural rituals and preservation rites that had begun in Sumer in the 3rd millennium BC still existed thousands of years later into the time of Alexander the Great. The text orders the Kalu priest to remove the first brick and to place it on an altar. The Kalu priest was then to sing lamentations in front of the brick, according to the age-old Mesopotamian tradition of laments and dirges sung for the destruction of cities and their architecture. These laments had been sung for the destruction of cities and for the terrible loss of their magnificent temples and sculptures during war in the 3rd millennium, as early as the 3rd millennium BC. In the Seleucid ritual that I just quoted, there was some sense that the original brick set up on the altar had to be appeased in some way, because you had to tear down the wall in order to rebuild it. So this was a destruction, so you had to appease the first brick. It was the first brick was the representative of the brick god Kula. Its removal from the original context of the building was played out as a temporary dislocation, while the repairs were being made as carefully as possible following the original ground plans of the temple. When an ancient wall had to be pulled down and rebuilt, a process of mourning had to take place in order to bridge the gap between the existence of the old wall and the rebuilding of the new wall. In another passage, the text also makes clear that the building site had to be surveyed by a Baru priest, a seer priest, so that nothing would be inadvertently missed by accident or damaged in the process of reconstruction. These are foundation deposits, which I'm going to discuss a little bit. The ancient Mesopotamians were constantly concerned with the reverence and respect for the remains of the past. And Mesopotamia is the first place where we can study these acts of preservation in both textual and archaeological evidence. We can even say that the reverence for the past and the concern with preservation was distinctive of Mesopotamia, and these concerns are at times similar to those of our own era. A lengthy compendium of omens, known as Shumma Alu, which in Akkadian means "if a city," after its opening lines, shows the concern with preservation very well. The text provides a long list of omens that have to do with conservation, and makes clear that they are intended not only for the king and those in power, but also for common people like us. So I'll quote a couple of lines. If a man repairs a sanctuary, he will have good luck. If a man tears down a sanctuary, the river will swallow him up. If someone relocates a chapel, that man will go to ruin. If a man repairs something old, that man's God will come to him. So these are just a few lines from a very long list of forms of restoration and omens and things that happen when you restore them, from images of gods and heroes to entire buildings and cities and architectural repairs. The texts even have a section of concern for surveyors who are planning to build at a particular location, so that if a man plans to build a house and while digging the foundations finds something in the ground that's old, he must follow particular procedure. All ancient objects found in the ground or that remain standing in temples or public places were considered to belong to the terrain and its history. Their preservation was propitious for the people and the land, for everyone in general. And these are the kinds of foundation deposits that they buried in the ground when they built structures, and the texts that they placed in them are addressed to the people in the future, saying, if you come in the future and you are restoring or building here, make sure that you put these back in their place. So they actually, ancient Mesopotamian texts are fascinating because they're among the only ancient texts that literally address us. We are meant to read them. We are the ideal reader because they thought that people in the distant future would find them and preserve the past. So despite all of the cycles of war and devastation through millennia of history, these antiquities of the land nevertheless survived in some form or another. In the 2nd century BC, a local governor of the south of Iraq called Adad-Nadin Ahe and his builders found statues of the king Gudea. Now, even if you don't know anything about ancient Mesopotamia, you've probably seen statues of Gudea because they're among the most famous types of objects from ancient Sumer, and there are many of them in the leading museums of the world. But these were not found in the original context in which they were made. Gudea ruled in the 3rd millennium BC, but they were actually found in a level dating to the 2nd century BC, because Adad-Nadin Ahe and his scholars, while they were building a new palace, ran across these statues accidentally in the ground. And what they did was they dug them up, they studied them. His scribes, who could still read ancient Sumerian, even though by now it was a dead language, studied the text, understood what this was, and then they placed them on display within the palace. So this was a form of collecting, a form of display of antiquities already in the 2nd century BC. He made his own bricks when he restored the palace. The lower right image is a brick, and he had his scribes write a bilingual inscription in Greek and in Aramaic to imitate the Sumerian methods of building and of writing inscriptions that he used in his own palace. So he then used it in his own palace. So they look like the Gudea bricks, but they are actually inscribed instead in the contemporary languages, which were Greek and Aramaic. So this is a really interesting episode of Mesopotamian history because it shows one of the earliest extant forms of antiquarianism and collecting that we have, and it prefigures such interests in, say, the Italian Renaissance. We even know the names of particular scholars, individuals. In ancient Babylon, there once lived a man called Nabu-Zerlisher. He was a scholar who was an expert in ancient languages and scripts. He also directed excavations and recorded the architectural remains and artifacts that were found under his supervision. So he had the ancient inscription. Then on the back of it, he wrote a scholarly commentary explaining such things as what it says, what era it dates to, where he found it, and where it belongs. Basically, these are exactly the methods that we use in scientific archaeology today. If I take my students out on a dig, this is what I expect them to record should they find something in the ground. So he actually did everything exactly right. In fact, these practices that we consider to be so modern existed in an earlier form already in ancient Mesopotamia. So the Mesopotamians understood these as traces of the past, and they also believed that when you put artifacts in the ground or erect them as architecture, that these monuments are the important things that we should study, but we should also understand what they felt. And this is what they understood about them. They saw these artifacts not simply as a way of looking back to their ancestors, as many ancient cultures do, but as reaching out into the future. They did see them as their ancestral past, but they saw them as a way of reaching out into the future, as an infinite form of presence through monuments and historical accounts. Their horizons of time were vast and distant, pushing forward into the future. Why was this the case? It was because of the manifest traces of the past themselves, which also evidenced the historical antiquity of the land. They saw the future through the lens of the traces of the past. And this is the important thing here, because I do think that that's relevant to what's going on today as well. The first historical evidence for conserving antiquities also comes from this part of the world. We always say that writing was invented here, cities, the law, and so on, but we should also add to this list of beginnings the practices of archaeology and conservation. The first clearly attested act of conservation emerges here. The famous Uruk vase, which you see on the right, it was actually one of the objects that was looted in the 2003 Iraq War, and it was damaged in the looting. This is a photograph that I took when I was working there. It was very fortunately found and returned, but it came back in pieces and then had to be restored. The interesting thing about it is that this was not the first time in its history that it had been damaged and restored. There is actually a part on the upper bit here that was damaged and repaired already before it was buried in the ground, which means around 3300 BC. So this vase was repaired, conserved in 3300 BC. So it's one of the first acts of conservation of an artifact that we have in the archaeological record. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and move to modernity. How am I doing for time? Okay, so I'm going to switch gears to what's happening now. So, and I just want to say that I've covered this ancient information in some detail for several reasons. I don't want you to think that I was just going on a historical tangent. First of all, to point out that people and monuments are intertwined. People and monuments are always entangled together, and that's something that we don't often think about very clearly. And I don't think that's limited to one culture and one society. People and monuments are intertwined. And that this entanglement was recognized in the literature and the rituals of antiquity. Secondly, preservation and conservation are not modern Western ideas, despite what so many people may lead you to believe. This is a claim that's often made, and unfortunately, this is a claim that's now also being made in order to demolish historical sites. So it's a claim that's made that, well, there is no interest in this past, that the interest in monuments is a modern concept, so you shouldn't attribute it to the past, which I've just demonstrated to you is not the case, something that can be scientifically shown to not be the case. And then now, the other side of it is that people like terrorists who want to destroy monuments now use this as an excuse to say, well, these are Western concepts, why are you bringing them here? These are Western concepts, they're alien to this region of the world, and so we can also use this excuse to now demolish historical sites. That's why I think it's really very important to get the historical information accurately. It's not a new idea. There is plenty of historical and archaeological evidence that shows this is not the case. The evidence is all to the contrary. And thirdly, it is exactly this evidence that is being wiped out, that is being erased and wiped out in order to rewrite history in somebody else's new vision. It's a deliberate erasure of historical fact. And that's why it's important for me to take you through this maybe tedious historical account, but you needed to hear it, okay? So along with the murder and displacement of the population, the aim of this violent erasure is the rewriting of history and the restructuring of the landscape for geopolitical goals. And you can see how then archaeology and history become utilized for very horrible ends. So rather than following cultural preservation policies that highlight heritage primarily in relation to tourist sites and concepts of global cultural heritage, we must consider the aims of this erasure, as it targets the local population and the local landscape. Groups such as ISIS claim that their destruction of pre-Islamic monuments and sites, Shiite and Yazidi shrines, as well as Christian churches and monasteries, are all justified acts of religious war, according to them. But their larger goals have clearly been territorial. This is Timbuktu, and I'm just kind of leaving Mesopotamia for a moment, but it is related. While it is clear today, as United Nations resolutions and international law have acknowledged, that cultural destruction is an act of war and even a war crime, that in August 2016, the International Criminal Court prosecuted in relation to the demolition of tombs in Timbuktu, this kind of prosecution has been somewhat selective. Many acts of direct targeting of heritage sites, including by UN member states, pass without much comment from the international community. The historical and archaeological scholarship on iconoclasm and memory has also had little to contribute here, preferring to focus often on earlier historical examples rather than anything that dates to the 2003 war and invasion of Iraq and its aftermath, which, as you have just heard, some of us experienced personally. On the right is Palmyra, on the left is New York. Furthermore, much of the work on preservation in war today is closely linked with government policies. Heritage is destroyed in war, ancient sites are occupied or deliberately attacked, but restoration now is also used as a declaration of victory. Governments and organizations compete over the control of the restoration of sites, as we saw was the case after the removal of ISIS from Palmyra in Syria. At the same time, so after ISIS was removed from Palmyra the first time, not the second time, there were declarations of immediate activity for restoration, which was clearly not the right thing to do. Many funding agencies in the United States and Western Europe appear to be also more concerned with the showcasing of new digital technologies than with tangible or material historical monuments. Some of these initiatives appropriate the heritage of Syria and Iraq for their own marketing purposes and profit in disturbing ways. While one may expect some companies to prefer the production of polyurethane replicas to restoring antiquities because of their own interests and profits, there is now also an effort to impose these replicas upon ancient sites themselves without regard for local views. This push for replicas has been aptly referred to as a new digital colonialism by some archaeologists who have written about the ethics of 3D printing Syria's cultural heritage, such as the Arch of Palmyra that was shown in London's Trafalgar Square and New York and Lower Manhattan. This is the photo that I have from when it was shown there. By the way, when it was exhibited, there was no label explaining what it was. It's a piece of an architectural structure, as you can see from the image on the right, but they turned it into this isolated form, so it's completely decontextualized. The visitor in Lower Manhattan had no idea what this thing was. It was just completely taken out of any historical context, made out of polyurethane, and it was at 2/3, I've written here 2/3 scale, made at 2/3 scale of the original, but this was not explained in a label, so people in London and New York thought this is the size of the original arch, and now they want to take this arch to Palmyra, which would be placing an incorrect model there on the site. Interestingly, the policy of replicas placed on heritage sites is one that was traditionally rejected by UNESCO and by archaeological practices in general. One of the requirements for the inscription of a site as a UNESCO World Heritage Site is quote-unquote authenticity. I say quote-unquote because, of course, things are always restored and rebuilt. Even on a campus like the Bloomington campus, that we have old buildings here, but they're cleaned up, they're repaired, they're restored. Things may have things repaired in them. A decade ago, UNESCO rejected Iraq's bid to place Babylon on the World Heritage List because the reconstructions of some of the walls on the site were inauthentic. And this is true, there were inauthentic walls on the site. Ironically, replication on site using modern synthetic materials and 3D printing techniques is now being promoted everywhere in Western Europe as the best course of action for the future of sites in Iraq and Syria. Since the 2003 war, there has been a great deal of devastation in Iraq and Syria. People have been killed, displaced, enslaved, tortured, cities have been demolished, and much more. In many cases, it is clear that the attacks on monuments are part and parcel of the strategy to erase local populations and their histories, and to utilize culture as a means to divide and wipe out history and people alike. This aspect of cultural destruction has had less attention in comparison to the idea that sites like Palmyra in Syria or Nimrud in Iraq are quote-unquote global cultural heritage. Cultural heritage policy today often dissociates the historical sites from both landscapes and peoples. In September of 2016, the President of France, François Hollande, announced a $100 million fund to protect cultural heritage, especially in Syria and Iraq. These funds, once they are raised, are to be allocated to post-war restoration of antiquities, while part of his plan is to offer asylum in Europe to artifacts that are in danger. While this is in no doubt an admirable pledge to protect cultural heritage, the reluctance to take in human refugees or to grant asylum to human refugees stands out in marked contrast to the concern for the artifacts. The disconnection of Mesopotamian history from the landscape and the people of the Middle East is exactly what earlier scholarship of Orientalist and post-colonial criticism, such as that of my late and most loved colleague Edward Said, attempted to point out. In the 19th century, collections of antiquities in museums such as the Louvre and the British Museum often presented their acquisitions as forms of rescue and preservation from ignorant populations unable to value their past. This renewed dissociation in much preservation policy is all the more surprising given the fact that the reason for the ISIS attacks on heritage sites such as Nimrud, Nineveh, and Palmyra, as well as the religious shrines and sanctuaries of any undesirable group, from Christians to Sufis to Shiites to Yazidis, is the erasure of the presence and histories of the diversity of the peoples of this area and the rewriting of the local history in their own vision, cleansed of the lives of others. At Columbia's Art History and Archaeology department, we have been immersed in a field project that I direct and that I began before the ISIS takeover in Mosul. It's called Mapping Mesopotamian Monuments, and this is a topographical survey that I began. I first envisaged the project in 2004 when I was working in Iraq. So this project has a long history. I originally thought of it as a response to the destruction of heritage that had resulted in the 2003 war and the occupation that followed. After waiting for US troops to officially withdraw from Iraq, therefore in 2011, I launched the field project in 2012. I raised the funds and started the field project right after the withdrawal of the troops in 2011. So the project started in 2012 after US forces left. We began the Mapping Mesopotamian Monuments field survey in the north of Iraq, in Iraqi Kurdistan, and have to date covered the monuments and historical architecture and carved rock reliefs in the mountainsides in the provinces of Dohuk, Erbil, and Suleymaniya, or Sleimani. As ISIS took over Mosul after our work began in our second season, we postponed the documentation of the region of Mosul and the Nineveh province until a later date, because that just became too dangerous. And what you're seeing here on the screen are a number of Assyrian rock reliefs high up in the mountains that date to about 700 BC. And this is all very arduous work. To document one site, we often have to spend 3 or 4 hours climbing a mountain with our equipment to get up to the top, just in order to make our record. So it's a topographical survey, but it covers all historical periods from ancient to modern, including rock reliefs in the cliffs, early Christian monasteries and churches, Islamic, Ottoman, and 20th century architecture. So here we are recording some Assyrian rock reliefs with my team, students and postdocs, and here with me in the center. And you can see how one of the graduate students is very precariously perched on the edge of a very high cliff in order to try to get a shot of these Assyrian reliefs of gods standing on the backs of their sacred animals high up in the mountains. And here there's an entire row of them. The figures are about life-size if you compare them. This pointer is not working, so I'm just kind of pretend pointing, I think. But if you compare them to my size, you will see that the figures are about my size. So these are quite monumental in scale. And there are rock reliefs like this all over the north of Iraq, but they haven't been properly documented because first there was earlier there was the Iraq War, before that there was the embargo, etc., and there was never really enough time to do it. This is an Ottoman house from the beginning of the 19th century in the Erbil Citadel. So we document these kinds of historical houses too. This is a medieval Islamic citadel in a place called Ahmadiyya, which is completely beautiful. It's a place that I would describe as a place that I would love to go and live, just to get away from everything. This is a medieval citadel gate that we went to document, and it still has, I don't know if you can see it from where you're sitting, there's an entwined serpent that creates the top of the archway, a sun disk with a face on it, and two figures of warriors left and right. This dates to about 1150 AD. And as we were documenting that gate, we accidentally, completely by surprise, discovered 3 rock reliefs that had never been known before and had never been published. I was with my students and we were documenting the medieval gate, and I said, everybody look to the right. And there were these rock reliefs, so we documented those, and those hopefully will be published very soon. And I should tell you that although we documented these in 2013, I held them back and refused to publish them. Although my graduate students were pushing me to publish, I refused to publish them because I did not want to locate them. I didn't want anybody to know where they were, but now I feel that the time has come that it's possible to share that information. They're also quite massive. That's Sardar, one of my graduate students, standing inside one of the reliefs to show you the scale. This is an early church called Rabban Hormuz in a monastery. It dates to the 5th or the 6th century AD, among the earliest churches, monasteries in the world. This is from just last year in the Slimaniya area. We were again doing rock reliefs, some of them going back to 2000 BC, high up in the mountains. And here you can see members of the team again on the edge of a cliff, and just like the difficult terrain that we have to manage when we get there. This is a fantastic relief from about 2000 BC in the Zagros Mountains that we documented just last spring. And I particularly love this one because of the way that it's carved at an angle. In fact, what the artist has done is the artist has used the way that the rock formation works with the kind of angling of the rock formation as a ground line for this sculpture. We've also worked in Turkey, southeastern Anatolia, and places like Diyarbakir, because this was also part of Mesopotamia in antiquity, and so we've also spent some time documenting monuments there. Some of our work can now be seen on our website, but I should say that the largest amount of cataloged information is available only, is on the catalog, and that's password protected. And it's only available if somebody is doing research and they write to us and they explain their research and they ask for a password. I'm still reluctant to make the website open to the public with all of the information. And one thing that I haven't made public, with or without password, you will not get the GPS coordinates. I have not let my team post any of the GPS coordinates, although there are a lot of so-called cultural heritage preservationists who are creating websites and putting up GPS coordinates. I personally don't think that's necessarily a great idea at this point in time, but others hold a different point of view from mine. So to conclude, the rise of scientific archaeology in Europe in the 19th century brought about a new and different engagement with the past that defined itself as a science. And this was an important moment in the history of scholarship and museology, a turning point that formed the basis for the way that we conduct our scientific work today. However, it was certainly not the first historical moment that when people had an interest in ruins. In early Arabic and Persian traditions in Islamic scholarship, writers such as Ibn Hawqal, who lived in the 10th century AD, already went to see Babylon and wrote about it. Yaqut al-Rumi's compendium of the 12th century AD discusses most of the ancient sites of the Near East, including Palmyra, Petra, Babylon, Nineveh, among others. And there are many, many more such scholars. I won't list them all for you from the Middle Ages, who wrote both in Arabic and in Persian. In the Ottoman period, Mehmed Zilli, known as Evliya Çelebi, wrote a travel and description of ancient monuments and buildings. It was called the Seyahatname, written in the 17th century. In Iran, in the Qajar dynasty, they likened their authority to that of the ancient Achaemenian kings, the pre-Islamic kings. And the Qajar rulers and the Ottoman rulers, both the sultans in Istanbul and the shahs in Tehran, documented photographically. This is a Qajar photograph of the 19th century. This is an Ottoman photograph from the sultan's albums, of one of Babylon, the other one of Persepolis, that shows you that they indeed were interested in these ancient sites. So for the first time now in this history, all of this is being wiped out, and there's clearly a particular agenda here. What is worrying is not just the physical destruction of heritage, but the total erasure and ethnic cleansing for the idea of some kind of religious purity. We have seen the devastating destructions of sites by terrorism and warfare, whether by state powers or militaries or by terrorist groups. But that's not all. The creation of exclusionary narratives is beginning to take hold across many communities, and that's equally disturbing. We are also seeing the rewriting and re-identification of heritage sites along ethnocentric lines. So a site may be, ancient, Roman, and it's being described as something else in order to fit a particular narrative with another agenda. So that's also disturbing. We're also, at the same time, witnessing terrible damage done by unsupervised development projects that don't follow the rule of law. When it comes to the legal imperatives of conducting surveying. So there are people who are building roads and bridges and all kinds of structures without following the Antiquities law, and therefore creating a lot of destruction through development at the same time. And here the burden of responsibility is not only on local populations and governments, but on international firms, companies that conduct this work. To be sure, local people have a responsibility as well to protect their heritage and to educate children about it, and to do so without falling into the trap of ethnocentricity and exclusionary politics. But as we are not emperors or kings, we are scholars and archaeologists like our great ancestor Nabu-Zerlisher. It is only by research and documentation, by the taking on of students and postdoc researchers in our home institutions, by adopting archaeological and preservation projects together with our colleagues in Iraq and Syria, and by having open lines of communication, that we can counter this existential threat to our shared history. Thank you.
You talk about some of the ways that war has kind of exploited cultural heritage sites. I was wondering if you could talk about maybe some of the more, I don't know, banal exploitation of where you have private people privately, taking advantage of a lot of the turmoil right now in Syria and purchasing objects. Who are the main culprits? How do you stop this? And also, if maybe you could put that in a context, does this predate maybe the Renaissance or the European interest in
Looting,
antiquities?
yeah, looting has always existed. I mean, we know, for example, in the pyramids of Giza in Egypt that they were already looted in antiquity, and right now there's a wonderful exhibition on in New York called something like Golden Kingdoms about the pre-Columbian Americas, and even much of that heritage had been looted. So looting has always existed. So I would say that it fits in with this whole story, because just as things have been destroyed deliberately as a way to get at people, and just as preservation has always existed, looting, there were always profiteers. There are always profiteers, and certainly in this particular war, one of the main culprits, as I'm sure many of you know already because you read newspapers, ISIS has profited tremendously from this. When they've gone into houses that have been, after they've taken over particular cities like Kobani or Erasure, and they find where ISIS leaders had their houses, they find registers of things that they were going to sell with categories and prices and what they are. So they were clearly setting out to steal these antiquities to profit off of them. So they would apparently damage some things in front of a video for, showing this on the internet, but in the meantime they were taking movable objects so that they could sell them. So they were profiting greatly from this. Of course, there was looting and selling antiquities before the ISIS war. This is not to say it never existed in the Middle East before. It's always existed, but the amount has increased tremendously. So when there's this kind of chaos, I don't think we can say this is a new thing. This is an old thing, but the increase in the amounts is definitely observable.
If I can just follow up, who in antiquity was, interested in, collecting it? Would it be collecting?
No, they wouldn't have collected it. They were just, in antiquity we assumed that what they were doing was just looking for valuable materials, gold, gems, things like that.
And I, of course, am aware of ISIS, engaging and using this as a, means of capital. But I'm wondering if on the Western side, who are the culprits? It was my.
You can see it as a kind of a connected trail, right? Because when ISIS steals it, they're not going to keep it on their, mantle, right? They're stealing it in order to sell it. So you have to ask, what is this market for? Who are the buyers? And where is it being sold? And unfortunately, the answer to that is a big part of the market is in the West. I won't say only in the West, because you can imagine that, there are collectors, in China and East Asia. There are other people who collect, not just in the West, but a very major part of the art market, the antiquities market, has been in Western Europe and the United States. Now, the authorities here are buckling down on this, so hopefully we'll see a slowing down.
First of all, thank you so much. This was a fantastic presentation. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your own emotions in your work, because as a historian, you're faced every day with this beautiful notion of these peoples desperately trying to preserve their culture and inviting us to be a part of it through these, notes, basically like notes that they wrote to us, those of us who live in their future. And I'm wondering, I'm a historian myself, so this is so weighty, and I'm wondering how you can handle, working with this day in and day out, and not just feeling crushed by the pressure of, oh my God, these people these artifacts have been, these love notes to the future have lasted for 4,000 years, and all of a sudden they're gone. Like, how do you handle that?
It's devastating. I mean, I'm glad you asked me that question, because it's a very difficult thing, and sometimes every day is a struggle. I most recently wrote a textbook. My most recent book is a textbook based on my undergraduate lectures for my students. And I started to write this textbook after ISIS took over Mosul. I felt that it was an important thing to do, and even though I was really tired and I didn't really feel like writing a textbook, I felt that it had to be done in order to have this information and to pass it on to future generations of students and so on. But to make a long story short, as I was writing it, I was writing chapter by chapter, and my editor wanted me to send each chapter as I finished it, because they wanted the book out quickly. And there were several chapters during which, while I was writing the chapter, I would open my laptop in the morning and look at the front page, and the things that I was working on for that chapter were being blown up. And that became very difficult. I thought, well, how can I write this chapter when I hear this? How can I even just put one foot in front of the other and go on? And I think that at one point I had to convince myself that to be active is better than to be passive. And it's just the one small thing that I can do, because of course human beings are more important. And I always feel, if I were a physician, if I had been a doctor, then I would have volunteered to go and help people in some way. But as this is the only thing that I know how to do, I feel it's the only contribution I can make. And so I push myself into going ahead, even though it's difficult.
Yeah, I mean, you spoke somewhat disparagingly of digital methods in this kind of work, and I certainly agree that putting up giant plastic replicas of ancient buildings really sounds like a terrible idea. I'm surprised anyone's doing that. On the other hand, I wonder, we have here at Indiana University a Virtual Heritage World Laboratory. We're doing a lot of work on using digital technologies, 3D modeling, virtual reality, as a means of preservation and presentation of material. And I wonder if you're doing anything like that in your work, if you're using drones or virtual reality.
No. I mean, I went through my project very quickly, but I mean, obviously, in our project, when we're climbing up those mountains and documenting those sites, we use all of the current technologies that we do have. We make 360 degrees processed immersive panoramas. We do photogrammetry. I mean, we are using those technologies as well, but my point, which I most probably did not express very clearly, is that these are technologies. It's sort of like if when I was a student in the 1980s, if people had said to me, oh, I have a great new technology, it's called Xeroxing, and why don't I just go and Xerox all these things? Yes, Xeroxing was great, it enabled us to have copies of articles, but it's a tool, right? I mean, I see these as a tool. I don't see it as the end point of something. Let us use the most cutting-edge technologies, but let us not think that they are the replacement or the solution. The solution is to protect the actual heritage and to use these as a tool to protect that. Of course, in the classroom, it's completely different. If we use this modeling in the classroom to perhaps show movement through a building or something, that's entirely different. But it worries me to say, well, it's okay that this building blew up because now I can just make a digital model and therefore I no longer need to restore this building. That I can't accept, because I feel, and I've spoken to a lot of Iraqis, when Nimrud was destroyed, I happened to be with a group of people from my part of the world, also archaeologists, and everybody immediately said, we have to restore it. It has to be restored. Every Iraqi I've spoken to has said, we need to restore it. We have to restore it. But a lot of preservationists in the West have said, no, you don't really need to restore it. Maybe you could just, kind of have some modeling, but see, I don't think that's right, because we are the major stakeholders, and we should be permitted to say whether or not we want. The people of Iraq have been devastated. They need to be allowed to restore the site if this is going to make them feel better. Yes?
So you mentioned how ISIS, so one of the arguments that ISIS employs in destroying these monuments is that in their process of rewriting history and maintaining the sort of religious purity. And then you also mentioned how they, and this is just to clarify, how they also use conservation as a Western concept. So is that an
Yes.
argument that they employ?
Well, I think the argument is not so much conservation, but the idea that, oh, well, why do you care about the past? I mean, this whole idea of archaeology and ancient things and to care about ancient things, well, that's not part of our tradition, that comes from somewhere else. So I'm trying to present the counter-narrative, because ISIS is much more powerful than I am. Not only do they have guns, but they're really good with the internet, and I am not. And so they can have all of these YouTube videos and I don't know what. I don't have that kind of PR. And so the counter-narrative is that what they're telling people on these YouTube videos is historically inaccurate. I'm sorry, I'm a teacher, so I'm pedantic. It's just historically inaccurate. And sometimes my friends say to me, yes, you're going to see an ISIS guy and you're going to say to him, that's just historically inaccurate. But it is. It's completely historically inaccurate. What they're trying to tell us that, well, this is not part of our history, we never cared about this past, is so untrue. This is like all of the ancient kings and palaces, the entire history of Islamic art and architecture is loaded with information about preservation of ancient heritage. So I think that that's just another way of rewriting that history that I don't accept, that I completely reject.
Mr. Shaban?
Thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Combination of archaeology and art and history. And it is sad to see all these things happen. What do you think about what's so-called recovery that the U.S., after the war, they started, holding smugglers who steal items and sell them on the Western world? How successful was that?
Well, they found some objects that had been looted from the museum in 2003, but certainly not all of it.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So, for example, the Uruk vase that I showed you, that was returned because of this policy that they established that, okay, let's have amnesty. If you have an object, bring it and we won't prosecute you. So that was a good thing. I mean, I think to have a way to reach out to people like that is good. However, at the time, there was a lot of use of archaeology for PR by the CPA and the US and coalition. And the way that I saw it, and for this I'm speaking as an eyewitness because I was there both in 2003 and 2004, a lot of this was used as public relations to say, well, the looting of the museum wasn't really all that bad because we were able to relocate this object and that object. And it's true, some important pieces were found and returned. We must, give them credit for that. But there were a lot of things that still have not been found.
It's more than 16,000 items.
There are a lot of things that have still not been found, that are still missing, and that's very, very unfortunate. The other thing that they did in 2003, and you can Google this and find it, is that I was there in the summer of 2003, and under Bremer's authority, a decision was made that the Iraq Museum must have an exhibition of the gold from the Nimrud tombs, from the tombs of the queens of Assyria from Nimrud. So all the curators had to hustle, they had to go to the vault, they had to take out the gold. They were given one day, basically 3 hours to install the exhibition and a couple of hours to take it down. It was an exhibition that was open only to members of the coalition provisional authority from various nations who were there in the green zone, and to journalists. It was not open to the public. Normal Iraqis were not allowed to come, but it was all over I was there during that exhibition. We were all joking about it and saying, this actually endangers the objects,
Yes.
because to rush through an exhibition and to say, because I've also worked as a curator, as you may have heard in the introduction, usually when you put on an exhibition in a museum, it takes minimum a year to prepare. It doesn't take 3 hours. And to just rush and put things up and take them down so quickly actually endangers the objects. But this was a directive that came from the highest authorities of the occupying power, and the curators had to do it. So that was really for public relations at the time.
One of they stole later?
No,
Some of
the
these?
Nimrod gold
They're
is still there,
the Nimrod
thank
gold.
God.
Yeah.
If I may, is there any comfort you can give those of us who watch the news accounts of ISIL taking hammers to
Yes, let me give you.
carvings and so on in the Muslim Museum?
Yeah, I
for instance?
didn't bring the Muslim museum, but I know. I think it was my first slide.
Is that gone
Can I
forever,
get to the
or is
first
there
slide?
hope for that kind of destruction, direct destruction?
Back.
Yeah, this slide here, the first slide, shows an Iraqi soldier standing on top of some rubble. So this is interesting because before ISIS was cleared out of this area, there were scholars here in the US who were reading satellite imagery. The reading of satellite imagery is very big in archaeology now, because you can get declassified things from the military and so on. You read satellite imagery to see the lay of the land. It can be very informative. And from reading the satellite imagery, we had thought it was all wiped out, that there was nothing left. But when archaeologists were able to actually go to Nimrod, they saw that there were big chunks of stone there. I was so devastated when I heard about Nimrod. I was writing that chapter on the Assyrian period, and I just, I literally started crying. I couldn't go on. But then when we saw that there were these big chunks, then we were encouraged, because we thought, it can be restored. With big chunks like this, you can do a restoration. You can do a proper restoration. I've seen, a lot of people don't know that, for example, the Campanile in Venice, like to take a famous Western site, in Venice, the big tower, the Campanile, that fell at the start of the 20th century from an earthquake. It was complete and utter rubble. It fell into hundreds and hundreds of pieces on the ground. Nothing was left of it. And it was completely restored out of the bits and pieces. So you would be surprised what can be done. And so something can be done. So I think that this is encouraging. It's not as bad as we thought. And because they were not very smart, they only attacked things that were visible. Of course, under the ground, there's a great deal more. So there is hope for a site like this, certainly.
Well, just as you were saying that, the lights came on outside to give us hope. So on that hopeful note, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Professor Bahrani.
So he had the ancient inscription. Then on the back of it, he wrote a scholarly commentary explaining such things as what it says, what era it dates to, where he found it, and where it belongs. Basically, these are exactly the methods that we use in scientific archaeology today. If I take my students out on a dig, this is what I expect them to record should they find something in the ground. So he actually did everything exactly right. In fact, these practices that we consider to be so modern existed in an earlier form already in ancient Mesopotamia. So the Mesopotamians understood these as traces of the past, and they also believed that when you put artifacts in the ground or erect them as architecture, that these monuments are the important things that we should study, but we should also understand what they felt. And this is what they understood about them. They saw these artifacts not simply as a way of looking back to their ancestors, as many ancient cultures do, but as reaching out into the future. They did see them as their ancestral past, but they saw them as a way of reaching out into the future, as an infinite form of presence through monuments and historical accounts. Their horizons of time were vast and distant, pushing forward into the future. Why was this the case? It was because of the manifest traces of the past themselves, which also evidenced the historical antiquity of the land. They saw the future through the lens of the traces of the past. And this is the important thing here, because I do think that that's relevant to what's going on today as well. The first historical evidence for conserving antiquities also comes from this part of the world. We always say that writing was invented here, cities, the law, and so on, but we should also add to this list of beginnings the practices of archaeology and conservation. The first clearly attested act of conservation emerges here. The famous Uruk vase, which you see on the right, it was actually one of the objects that was looted in the 2003 Iraq War, and it was damaged in the looting. This is a photograph that I took when I was working there. It was very fortunately found and returned, but it came back in pieces and then had to be restored. The interesting thing about it is that this was not the first time in its history that it had been damaged and restored. There is actually a part on the upper bit here that was damaged and repaired already before it was buried in the ground, which means around 3300 BC. So this vase was repaired, conserved in 3300 BC. So it's one of the first acts of conservation of an artifact that we have in the archaeological record. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and move to modernity. How am I doing for time? Okay, so I'm going to switch gears to what's happening now. So, and I just want to say that I've covered this ancient information in some detail for several reasons. I don't want you to think that I was just going on a historical tangent. First of all, to point out that people and monuments are intertwined. People and monuments are always entangled together, and that's something that we don't often think about very clearly. And I don't think that's limited to one culture and one society. People and monuments are intertwined. And that this entanglement was recognized in the literature and the rituals of antiquity. Secondly, preservation and conservation are not modern Western ideas, despite what so many people may lead you to believe. This is a claim that's often made, And unfortunately, this is a claim that's now also being made in order to demolish historical sites. So it's a claim that's made that, well, there is no interest in this past, that the interest in monuments is a modern concept, so you shouldn't attribute it to the past, which I've just demonstrated to you is not the case, something that can be scientifically shown to not be the case. And then now, the other side of it is that people like terrorists who want to destroy monuments now use this as an excuse to say, well, these are Western concepts, why are you bringing them here? These are Western concepts, they're alien to this region of the world, and so we can also use this excuse to now demolish historical sites. That's why I think it's really very important to get the historical information accurately. It's not a new idea. There is plenty of historical and archaeological evidence that shows this is not the case. The evidence is all to the contrary. And thirdly, it is exactly this evidence that is being wiped out, that is being erased and wiped out in order to rewrite history in somebody else's new vision. It's a deliberate erasure of historical fact. And that's why it's important for me to take you through this maybe tedious historical account, but you needed to hear it, okay? So along with the murder and displacement of the population, the aim of this violent erasure is the rewriting of history and the restructuring of the landscape for geopolitical goals. And you can see how then archaeology and history become utilized for very horrible ends. So rather than following cultural preservation policies that highlight heritage primarily in relation to tourist sites and concepts of global cultural heritage, we must consider the aims of this erasure, as it targets the local population and the local landscape. Groups such as ISIS claim that their destruction of pre-Islamic monuments and sites, Shiite and Yazidi shrines, as well as Christian churches and monasteries, are all justified acts of religious war, according to them, but their larger goals have clearly been territorial. This is Timbuktu, and I'm just kind of leaving Mesopotamia for a moment, but it is related. While it is clear today, as United Nations resolutions and international law have acknowledged, that cultural destruction is an act of war and even a war crime, that in August 2016, the International Criminal Court prosecuted in relation to the demolition of tombs in Timbuktu, this kind of prosecution has been somewhat selective. Many acts of direct targeting of heritage sites, including by UN member states, pass without much comment from the international community. The historical and archaeological scholarship on iconoclasm and memory has also had little to contribute here, preferring to focus often on earlier historical examples rather than anything that dates to the 2003 war and invasion of Iraq and its aftermath, which, as you have just heard, some of us experienced personally. On the right is Palmyra, on the left is New York. Furthermore, much of the work on preservation in war today is closely linked with government policies. Heritage is destroyed in war, ancient sites are occupied or deliberately attacked, but restoration now is also used as a declaration of victory. Governments and organizations compete over the control of the restoration of sites, as we saw was the case after the removal of ISIS from Palmyra in Syria. At the same time, So after ISIS was removed from Palmyra the first time, not the second time, there were declarations of immediate activity for restoration, which was clearly not the right thing to do. Many funding agencies in the United States and Western Europe appear to be also more concerned with the showcasing of new digital technologies than with tangible or material historical monuments. Some of these initiatives appropriate the heritage of Syria and Iraq for their own marketing purposes and profit in disturbing ways. While one may expect some companies to prefer the production of polyurethane replicas to restoring antiquities because of their own interests and profits, there is now also an effort to impose these replicas upon ancient sites themselves without regard for local views. This push for replicas has been aptly referred to as a new digital colonialism by some archaeologists who have written about the ethics of 3D printing Syria's cultural heritage, such as the Arch of Palmyra that was shown in London's Trafalgar Square and in New York and Lower Manhattan. This is the photo that I have from when it was shown there. By the way, when it was exhibited, there was no label explaining what it was. It's a piece of an architectural structure, as you can see from the image on the right, but they turned it into this isolated form, so it's completely decontextualized. The visitor in Lower Manhattan had no idea what this thing was. It was just completely taken out of any historical context, made out of polyurethane, and it was at 2/3, I've written here 2/3 scale, made at 2/3 scale of the original, but this was not explained in a label, so people in London and New York thought this is the size of the original arch, and now they want to take this arch to actually to Palmyra, which would be placing an incorrect model there on the site. Interestingly, the policy of replicas placed on heritage sites is one that was traditionally rejected by UNESCO and by archaeological practices in general. One of the requirements for the inscription of a site as a UNESCO World Heritage Site is quote-unquote authenticity. I say quote-unquote because, of course, things are always restored and rebuilt. Even on a campus like the Bloomington campus, that we have old buildings here, but they're cleaned up, they're repaired, they're restored. Things may have things repaired in them. A decade ago, UNESCO rejected Iraq's bid to place Babylon on the World Heritage List because the reconstructions of some of the walls on the site were inauthentic. And this is true, there were inauthentic walls on the site. Ironically, replication on site using modern synthetic materials and 3D printing techniques is now being promoted everywhere in Western Europe as the best course of action for the future of sites in Iraq and Syria. Since the 2003 war, there has been a great deal of devastation in Iraq and Syria. People have been killed, displaced, enslaved, tortured, cities have been demolished, and much more. In many cases, it is clear that the attacks on monuments are part and parcel of this strategy to erase local populations and their histories, and to utilize culture as a means to divide and wipe out history and people alike. This aspect of cultural destruction has had less attention in comparison to the idea that sites like Palmyra in Syria or Nimrud in Iraq are quote-unquote global cultural heritage. Cultural heritage policy today often dissociates the historical sites from both landscapes and peoples. In September of 2016, the President of France, François Hollande, announced a $100 million fund to protect cultural heritage, especially in Syria and Iraq. These funds, once they are raised, are to be allocated to post-war restoration of antiquities, while part of his plan is to offer asylum in Europe to artifacts that are in danger. While this is in no doubt an admirable pledge to protect cultural heritage, the reluctance to take in human refugees or to grant asylum to human refugees stands out in marked contrast to the concern for the artifacts. The disconnection of Mesopotamian history from the landscape and the people of the Middle East is exactly what earlier scholarship of Orientalist and post-colonial criticism, such as that of my late and most loved colleague Edward Said, attempted to point out. In the 19th century, collections of antiquities in museums such as the Louvre and the British Museum often presented their acquisitions as forms of rescue and preservation from ignorant populations unable to value their past. This renewed dissociation in much preservation policy is all the more surprising given the fact that the reason for the ISIS attacks on heritage sites such as Nimrud, Nineveh, and Palmyra, as well as the religious shrines and sanctuaries of any undesirable group, from Christians to Sufis to Shiites to Yazidis, is the erasure of the presence and histories of the diversity of the peoples of this area, and the rewriting of the local history in their own vision, cleansed of the lives of others. At Columbia's Art History and Archaeology department, we have been immersed in a field project that I direct and that I began before the ISIS takeover in Mosul. It's called Mapping Mesopotamian Monuments, and this is a topographical survey that I began. I first envisaged the project in 2004 when I was working in Iraq. So this project has a long history. I originally thought of it as a response to the destruction of heritage that had resulted in the 2003 war and the occupation that followed. After waiting for US troops to officially withdraw from Iraq, therefore in 2011, I launched the field project in 2012. I raised the funds and started the field project right after the withdrawal of the troops in 2011. So the project started in 2012 after US forces left. We began the Mapping Mesopotamian Monuments field survey in the north of Iraq, in Iraqi Kurdistan, and have to date covered the monuments and historical architecture and carved rock reliefs in the mountainsides in the provinces of Dohuk, Arbil, and Suleymaniya, or Sleimani. As ISIS took over Mosul after our work began in our second season, we postponed the documentation of the region of Mosul and the Nineveh province until a later date, because that just became too dangerous. And what you're seeing here on the screen are a number of Assyrian rock reliefs high up in the mountains that date to about 700 BC. And this is all very arduous work. To document one site, we often have to spend 3 or 4 hours climbing a mountain with our equipment to get up to the top, just in order to make our record. So it's a topographical survey, but it covers all historical periods from ancient to modern, including rock reliefs in the cliffs, early Christian monasteries and churches, Islamic, Ottoman, and 20th century architecture. So here we are recording some Assyrian rock reliefs with my team, students and postdocs, and here with me in the center. And you can see how one of the graduate students is very precariously perched on the edge of a very high cliff in order to try to get a shot of these Assyrian reliefs of gods standing on the backs of their sacred animals high up in the mountains. And here there's an entire row of them. The figures are about life-size if you compare them, this pointer is not working, so I'm just kind of pretend pointing, I think. But if you compare them to my size, you'll see that the figures are about my size. So these are quite monumental in scale. And there are rock reliefs like this all over the north of Iraq, but they haven't been properly documented because first there was earlier there was the Iraq War, before that there was the embargo, etc., and there was never really enough time to do it. This is an Ottoman house from the beginning of the 19th century in the Erbil Citadel. So we document these kinds of historical houses too. This is a medieval Islamic citadel in a place called Ahmadiyya, which is completely beautiful. It's like a place that I would describe as a place that I would love to go and live, just to get away from everything. This is a medieval citadel gate that we went to document, and it still has, I don't know if you can see it from where you're sitting, there's an entwined serpent that creates the top of the archway, a sun disk with a face on it, and two figures of warriors left and right. This dates to about 1150 AD. And as we were documenting that gate, we accidentally, completely by surprise, discovered 3 rock reliefs that had never been known before and had never been published. I was with my students and we were documenting the medieval gate, and I said, everybody, look to the right! And there were these rock reliefs, so we documented those, and those hopefully will be published very soon. And I should tell you that although we documented these in 2013, I held them back and refused to publish them. Although my graduate students were pushing me to publish, I refused to publish them because I did not want to locate them. I didn't want anybody to know where they were, but now I feel that the time has come that it's possible to share that information. They're also quite massive. That's Sardar, one of my graduate students, standing inside one of the reliefs to show you the scale. This is an early church called Rabban Hormuz in a monastery. It dates to the 5th or the 6th century AD, among the earliest churches, monasteries in the world. This is from just last year in the Slimaniya area. We were again doing rock reliefs, some of them going back to 2000 BC, high up in the mountains. And here you can see members of the team, again on the edge of a cliff, and just like the difficult terrain that we have to manage when we get there. This is a fantastic relief from about 2000 BC in the Zagros Mountains that we documented just last spring. And I particularly love this one because of the way that it's carved at an angle. In fact, what the artist has done is the artist has used the way that the rock formation works with the kind of angling of the rock formation as a ground line for this sculpture. We've also worked in Turkey, southeastern Anatolia, and places like Diyarbakir, because this was also part of Mesopotamia in antiquity, and so we've also spent some time documenting monuments there. Some of our work can now be seen on our website, but I should say that the largest amount of cataloged information is available only is on the catalog, and that's password protected. And it's only available if somebody is doing research and they write to us and they explain their research and they ask for a password. I'm still reluctant to make the website open to the public with all of the information. And one thing that I haven't made public, with or without password, you will not get the GPS coordinates. I have not let my team post any of the GPS coordinates, although there are a lot of so-called cultural heritage preservationists who are creating websites and putting up GPS coordinates. I personally don't think that's necessarily a great idea at this point in time, but others hold a different point of view. from mine. So to conclude, the rise of scientific archaeology in Europe in the 19th century brought about a new and different engagement with the past that defined itself as a science. And this was an important moment in the history of scholarship and museology, a turning point that formed the basis for the way that we conduct our scientific work today. However, it was certainly not the first historical moment that when people had an interest in ruins. In early Arabic and Persian traditions in Islamic scholarship, writers such as Ibn Hawqal, who lived in the 10th century AD, already went to see Babylon and wrote about it. Yaqut al-Rumi's compendium of the 12th century AD discusses most of the ancient sites of the Near East, including Palmyra, Petra, Babylon, Nineveh, among others. And there are many, many more such scholars. I won't list them all for you from the Middle Ages, who wrote both in Arabic and in Persian. In the Ottoman period, Mehmed Zilli, known as Evliya Çelebi, wrote a travel and description of ancient monuments and buildings. It was called the Seyahatname, written in the 17th century. In Iran, in the Qajar dynasty, they likened their authority to that of the ancient Achaemenian kings, the pre-Islamic kings. And the Qajar rulers and the Ottoman rulers, both the sultans in Istanbul and the Shahs in Tehran, documented photographically. This is a Qajar photograph of the 19th century. This is an Ottoman photograph from the Sultan's albums, of one of Babylon, the other one of Persepolis, that shows you that they indeed were interested in these ancient sites. So for the first time now in this history, all of this is being wiped out, and there's clearly a particular agenda here. What is worrying is not just the physical destruction of heritage, but the total erasure and ethnic cleansing for the idea of some kind of religious purity. We have seen the devastating destructions of sites by terrorism and warfare, whether by state powers or militaries or by terrorist groups. But that's not all. The creation of exclusionary narratives is beginning to take hold across many communities, and that's equally disturbing. We are also seeing the rewriting and re-identification of heritage sites along ethnocentric lines. So a site may be, ancient, Roman, and it's being described as something else in order to fit a particular narrative with another agenda. So that's also disturbing. We're also, at the same time, witnessing terrible damage done by unsupervised development projects that don't follow the rule of law. When it comes to the legal imperatives of conducting surveying. So there are people who are building roads and bridges and all kinds of structures without following the Antiquities law, and therefore creating a lot of destruction through development at the same time. And here the burden of responsibility is not only on local populations and governments, but on international firms, companies that conduct this work. To be sure, local people have a responsibility as well to protect their heritage and to educate children about it, and to do so without falling into the trap of ethnocentricity and exclusionary politics. But as we are not emperors or kings, we are scholars and archaeologists like our great ancestor Nabu-Zerlisher. It is only by research and documentation, by the taking on of students and postdoc researchers in our home institutions, by adopting archaeological and preservation projects together with our colleagues in Iraq and Syria, and by having open lines of communication, that we can counter this existential threat to our shared history. Thank you.